It really makes you think about that saying living in the moment, doesn't it?
It does.
Because it seems like it's often in the face of tragedy that the idea of just enjoying the moment really hits home. And tragically, that's what happened this past weekend in Birmingham. The contrast between a night out, the joy of being with friends, and then suddenly gun violence.
And what really strikes me about this particular shooting in 5 Points South is that this wasn't just a random act, you know? It bears the hallmarks of a targeted hit, a very calculated, premeditated act of violence, and the fact that it unfolded in the middle of a crowd, people who are out celebrating, enjoying their lives, adds a really chilling layer to it.
Right. It's not like it was some random,
Yeah.
Wednesday night and nobody's around. This was a busy
Exactly.
weekend. So for listeners who aren't familiar with Birmingham, can you kind of paint a picture for us? Set the scene. What is 5 Points South? What kind of place is this?
So imagine a really vibrant district, bustling with restaurants and bars, live music spilling out into the street. It's a real hub for nightlife,
Mm-hmm.
especially for students because it's near UAB. And, people go there to connect, to let loose, to have fun. So to think about that energy, that vibrancy being shattered by such a calculated act of violence is jarring, to say the least.
It is. And, we've covered similar events, and sometimes it's, a back alley or it's a drive-by. But this was a place where people are supposed to be able to go and enjoy themselves
Right.
and let their guard down and have a good time. And to know that somebody was actually paid to take another life there. I mean, that speaks to a whole other level when you're talking about premeditation.
Absolutely. That points to a level of organization that, perhaps even suggests a connection to organized crime. I think that's something that should give us all pause. Because while the police have said, there was an intended target, the reality is in a crowded place like 5 Points on a Saturday night,
Yeah.
innocent bystanders are almost unavoidable.
Right. It's that wrong place, wrong time scenario.
Absolutely.
What everyone worries about. And speaking of the intent target, this is where things get really interesting and kind of murky. Because the police have said that the target of the shooting was killed, but they haven't released the name. So do we know anything about who this person was? What might have made them the reason for this?
Well, and that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And right now we just don't have those answers. But here's what we do know. Targeted hits, by their very nature, are rarely some sort of crime of passion or a random act of rage. They're often very calculated, and they're usually tied to some specific criminal activity, whether that's gang-related, maybe some kind of retribution, a power struggle within some sort of criminal enterprise, or even something as, seemingly straightforward as a debt that went wrong. But the level of planning that's involved here really suggests that there is a much deeper motive. And I think a more complex story is waiting to be uncovered.
It's almost like Birmingham is facing a double whammy here. Because if you look at national news, it seems like at least the crime rate is going down.
Well, that's right. I mean, nationally, the FBI's own data for the first quarter of this year shows a significant decrease in violent crime compared to last year. So that's a glimmer of hope in what feels like a very bleak landscape sometimes.
Right. But then you look at Birmingham, and it seems like a completely different story.
Exactly. It's while those national numbers are trending downward, Birmingham has unfortunately seen a pretty tragic uptick in violence. And in fact, during that same period where we see national numbers going down, Birmingham experienced a 41% increase in murders.
Wow.
The mayor has gone so far as to call gun violence an epidemic in the city. And sadly, the statistics back him up. This wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger and frankly deeply concerning trend.
Yeah, and something that I think makes it even more disturbing is this detail that's come out about the possible involvement of these illegal gun conversion devices that law enforcement are calling switches. That, to me, just adds a whole other layer of danger to this story.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. The idea that something so small can be so easily concealed and can transform a legal handgun into something that can unleash so much chaos.
I have to admit, I don't know a lot about the technical side of firearms, so. For those of us who are listening who are in the same boat, could you explain exactly what is a switch? What makes them so dangerous?
Yeah, so in the simplest terms, a switch is a device that's usually quite small. We're talking often no bigger than a dime. And it's illegally modified to basically convert a semi-automatic firearm into a fully automatic weapon.
Okay, and I realize this is probably a dumb question, but what's the difference?
So imagine this. With a semi-automatic, you have to pull the trigger every time you want to fire a round. But when you install a switch, you can just hold down the trigger. And the weapon will just fire continuously until you either release the trigger or you run out of ammunition. So it really increases the weapon's rate of fire.
Which is terrifying because I was reading that these modifications can be made so quickly,
Yeah.
like less than a minute to convert a handgun. It's incredible.
It's less time than it takes to order a coffee. And that's really what makes these devices so terrifying for law enforcement. Because you combine that ease of use with their ability to increase the lethality of a weapon. And it's a really dangerous combination. And, it's not just the immediate danger that they pose. It's the fact that the authorities suspect that a switch was used in this shooting. After they just had that crackdown back in July, it makes you wonder how prevalent these things are.
Yeah. If they were already on law enforcement's radar, were those efforts enough? Or is this a sign that, this is just the tip of the iceberg?
Right. And it kind of makes you think, we often get caught up in the technical details, like the how of these situations, but we can't forget that there's real people behind this.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the weeds of this stuff, but at the end of the day, 4 people lost their lives. Families were shattered, and a community is left picking up the pieces.
And it's not just those immediate victims either, right? Think about the people who survived.
Right.
The people who witnessed what happened.
Yeah.
The trauma of that night, the sights, the sounds. That's something that leaves an invisible scar.
Yeah, one of the articles I read talked about a witness, Dejan Singleton was his name, and he talked about just hearing this, grieving type screaming and seeing people being carried out on stretchers.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of experience, you don't just walk away from that.
And even for the people who weren't there in that moment. But, they go to 5 Points. They see it as a place of joy, a place of community. There's a sense of violation.
Yeah.
A loss of innocence that can be just as impactful, I think.
Yeah, like the mayor said this isn't normal. But it's getting harder and harder to ignore the feeling that maybe it is. It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, part of me wants to believe that.
Yeah.
We can create a world where this kind of thing just doesn't happen. But then something like this happens, and it just feels like, is that even possible?
It's a painful truth. And, I think a lot of people are struggling with that right now, especially in Birmingham. This shooting has really exposed this raw nerve, a sense of unease that goes way beyond this one event.
And, it's easy for people, especially if they don't live in Birmingham,
Right.
to hear about this and think, oh, that's awful by you. It wouldn't happen here,
Right.
But the reality is,
Yeah.
it could. It could happen anywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important that we don't just move on from this, that we don't allow it to just become another statistic, another news cycle. We have to use this moment, as difficult as it is, to have a real conversation about the kind of society we want to live in.
It's like we're always trying to strike this balance between individual freedom and then, keeping everybody safe.
Yeah.
And it seems like sometimes those two things are at odds with each other.
It's a tension that's at the heart of so many challenges, I think. On the one hand, we cherish this idea of individual liberty. We want to be able to live our lives without fear, without undue restrictions. But when those freedoms come at the expense of other people's safety, when innocent lives are lost because someone else chose to exploit those freedoms, we have a responsibility to ask some tough questions.
Like, where do we draw the line? How do we create a society that honors, both individual liberty, but also the collective good?
Yeah, and those are the million-dollar questions. And while there are no easy answers, I do think that there are steps that we can take, both as individuals and as a society. And I think we have to start by recognizing that this isn't just a law enforcement issue, it's a public health crisis.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think about gun violence as a disease, which in a lot of ways it is, we can't just focus on treating the symptoms. We have to look at the root causes, things like poverty and inequality, lack of access to mental health services, lack of opportunities for young people. It's about changing the conditions that allow violence to flourish in the first place.
So it's about creating a world where someone doesn't feel like picking up a gun is their only option.
Exactly. And that requires a commitment from all of us. It's not just about passing laws or funding programs. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about having these tough conversations about race, about poverty, about the things that make us uncomfortable. And it's about listening to each other, even when it's hard.
It's definitely been a heavy deep dive today.
It has.
There's no getting around that. But it's also a reminder that we can't let these tragedies be in vain.
Right.
We owe it to the victims. We owe it to their families. And frankly, we owe it to ourselves to create a better world. And maybe that starts by each of us asking ourselves, what role am I going to play in making that happen?